The National Electrical Code, specifically Section 110.26c, addresses workspace requirements for electrical equipment operating at 600 volts or less nominal. These requirements are in place to ensure the safety of qualified electrical workers who may need to inspect, maintain, or repair the equipment while it is energized. The question pertains to an existing 4000 kVA substation with a 13.2 kilovolts primary situated in a large open room. The back of the substation is approximately 2 feet from the wall behind it, and there is about 14 feet of clear space in front, with both sides being clear. The owner intends to erect a new wall about 5 feet from one side of the substation, effectively eliminating access to one end of the equipment. The central issue is whether the user can leverage exceptions, or B of 110.26c to circumvent the standard clear space requirements despite the limited space behind the substation and the obstruction created by the new wall. Exception of 110.26c permits a reduced clear space if the equipment is installed in a room or enclosure and is under the sole control of qualified persons, and if the clear space is not less than 30 inches wide in front of the equipment and not less than 30 inches deep behind the equipment. This exception is designed to provide flexibility in specialized environments where access is restricted to trained professionals. The key provision that disqualifies the scenario is the requirement for at least 30 inches of clear space behind the equipment. In the described situation, there are only 2 feet or 24 inches behind the substation. Therefore, exception A cannot be applied because the minimum depth requirement behind the equipment is not met. Exception B of 110.26c allows for a reduced clear space if the equipment has one or more doors or hinge covers and the doors or hinge covers are capable of opening at least 90 degrees. In such cases, the clear space is not required to exceed the depth required to permit the door or cover to open 90 degrees. However, this exception mandates that there must be at least 24 inches of clear space at the end of the equipment to provide adequate access. The proposed new wall, positioned 5 feet from one side of the substation, will block access to one end of the equipment. Even if there is sufficient space for the doors or covers to open 90 degrees, the obstruction of access to one end disqualifies the use of exception B. The code emphasizes the need for clear access to the equipment, and the new wall would impede this access. In summary, the presented scenario does not meet the conditions outlined in either exception or exception B of 110.26c. The limited space behind the substation violates the minimum depth requirement of exception A, and the new wall obstructing access to one end of the equipment violates the access requirement of exception B. Therefore, the standard clear space requirements of 110.26 and B must be adhered to. To comply with the code, the user must ensure that the substation has the required clear space in front, behind, and on both sides, taking into account the voltage and the conditions of the installation. The specific clear space requirements depend on the nominal voltage to ground of the equipment and the condition of the space opposite the equipment. For example, if the nominal voltage to ground is between 151 volts and 600 volts and there are exposed live parts on both sides of the workspace or exposed live parts on one side and grounded parts on the other side, the required clear distance is 4 feet. If the nominal voltage to ground is between 151 volts and 600 volts and there are grounded parts on both sides of the workspace, the required clear distance is 3 feet. If the nominal voltage to ground is between 151 volts and 600 volts and there are no obstructions, the required clear distance is 3 feet. These distances are measured from the enclosure or opening if the live parts are enclosed. It is crucial to accurately assess the specific conditions of the installation and the voltage to ground to determine the correct clear space requirements. The National Electrical Code is a comprehensive document, and its proper application requires a thorough understanding of its provisions. It is always recommended to consult with a qualified electrical engineer or inspector to ensure compliance with the code and to maintain a safe electrical environment. The goal is to provide a safe working environment for qualified personnel while working on energized electrical equipment. This often means adherence to specific distances and clearances that are not always intuitive. Understanding the nuances of the code, and specifically the exceptions, is key to a safe and compliant installation. It is also important to consider that local jurisdictions may have amendments to the National Electrical Code, so it is always wise to check with the local authority having jurisdiction to ensure full compliance. Finally, documentation of any decisions related to code compliance is always recommended, especially in situations where interpretations may be required. This documentation can be helpful in the event of an inspection or audit. The National Electrical Code NEC Section 110.26 outlines the requirements for working space about electrical equipment. This section is critical for ensuring the safety of personnel who may be required to inspect, maintain, or operate electrical equipment. The primary goal is to provide adequate space to perform these tasks safely. Subsection 110.26 details the dimensions of the working space, including depth, width, and height. The depth of the working space is determined by the voltage to ground of the equipment and the conditions present on the opposite side of the working space. These conditions are typically categorized as Condition 1, Condition 2, and Condition 3, each requiring different depths of working space. Subsection 110.26b specifies the width of the working space, which must be the width of the equipment or 30 inches, whichever is greater. This width must be maintained from the floor to the height required by 110.26c. Subsection 110.26c addresses the entrance to the working space. At least one entrance of sufficient area must be provided to give access to the working space about electrical equipment. The location of this entrance is subject to specific requirements based on the size and arrangement of the equipment. As mentioned before, the two exceptions to entrance requirements in 110.26c are not applicable due to the conditions outlined in the question. Exception A requires at least 30 inches of clear space behind the equipment, which is not met. Exception B requires at least 24 inches of clear space at the end of the equipment, which is obstructed by the new wall. Subsection 110.26d covers illumination requirements. Adequate illumination must be provided for all working spaces about electrical equipment. This illumination helps to ensure that personnel can safely perform their tasks. Subsection 110.26e specifies the headroom requirements. The minimum headroom for working spaces about service equipment, switchboards, paddleboards, or motor control centers must be 6 feet 6 inches. This height is measured from the floor or platform to the lowest obstruction above the working space. It is important to note that equipment is often designed and installed to maximize space utilization while also adhering to safety standards. However, any modifications or alterations to the installation, such as the proposed new wall, must be carefully evaluated to ensure that they do not compromise the required working space and access. In situations where space is limited, it may be necessary to relocate the equipment or to implement alternative solutions that comply with the NEC requirements. These solutions may include using smaller equipment, reconfiguring the layout of the room, or providing additional access points to the working space. Another critical aspect to consider is the maintenance and upkeep of the working space. The working space must be kept clear of obstructions and hazards to ensure that personnel can safely access and work on the equipment. This includes keeping the floor clean and dry, removing any tools or materials that are not needed, and ensuring that the lighting is adequate. In summary, the working space requirements outlined in NEC Section 110.26 are essential for ensuring the safety of personnel who work on or near electrical equipment. These requirements cover the dimensions of the working space, the entrance to the working space, illumination, and headroom. It is crucial to understand and comply with these requirements to prevent accidents and injuries. Remember, the National Electrical Code is not just a set of rules. It is a collection of best practices that have been developed over many years to protect people and property from electrical hazards. By following the code, we can create a safer electrical environment for everyone. When dealing with electrical installations, it is always best to consult with a qualified electrical engineer or inspector. These professionals have the knowledge and experience to ensure that the installation complies with all applicable codes and standards. They can also help to identify potential hazards and to develop solutions to mitigate them. In conclusion, the question highlighted a common scenario where space constraints can lead to potential violations of the National Electrical Code. By carefully evaluating the specific requirements of the code and by consulting with qualified professionals, it is possible to ensure that electrical installations are both safe and compliant. The key takeaways are that the minimum clear space requirements must be met, the access to the working space must be maintained, and the overall safety of personnel must be the top priority. The existing conditions do not allow for either exception mentioned, and standard clearances must be maintained according to NEC 110.26 and B. It is critical to not only consider the initial installation but also any future modifications or alterations that may impact the working space and access to electrical equipment. Regular inspections and maintenance are essential to ensure that the working space remains safe and compliant over time. The original scenario involves an existing electrical substation with limited clearance. The inquiry concerns the feasibility of reducing the required clear space by utilizing exceptions within the National Electrical Code NEC section 110.26c. This section pertains to the entrance and egress requirements for working spaces around electrical equipment. The existing substation is situated in a large open room with its back positioned approximately 2 feet from the wall behind it. The front of the substation has a clear space of about 14 feet, and both sides are unobstructed. The owner intends to construct a new wall 5 feet from one side of the substation, which will block access to one end of the equipment. The inquiry specifically references NEC 110.26c, which addresses access and entrance to working space. The exceptions within this section outline circumstances under which the prescribed access requirements can be modified. Exception allows for reduction in clear space if the equipment is under the control of qualified personnel and if specific minimum clearance dimensions are met. This exception stipulates a minimum clear space of 30 inches behind the equipment. However, in the existing scenario, the substation is positioned only 2 feet 24 inches from the wall behind it, rendering exception inapplicable. Exception B pertains to situations where equipment has doors or hinged covers capable of opening at least 90 degrees. This exception mandates a minimum clear space of 24 inches at the end of the equipment to facilitate access. The proposed new wall, situated 5 feet from one side of the substation, will obstruct access to one end of the equipment. Consequently, exception B cannot be invoked as the required access is compromised by the wall construction. The code mandates specific working space clearances to ensure the safety of qualified personnel who may need to inspect, maintain, or operate the electrical equipment. These clearances provide sufficient room for movement, access, and safe working practices. Given the limited space behind the substation and the obstruction created by the new wall, neither exception nor exception B of NEC 110.26c can be utilized. Therefore, the standard clear space requirements of NEC 110.26 and B must be adhered to. These sections outline the minimum required depth, width, and height of the working space based on factors such as voltage levels and conditions present. To ensure code compliance and maintain a safe working environment, the user must ensure that the substation has the required clear space in front, behind, and on both sides, in accordance with NEC 110.26 and B. This may necessitate relocating the substation or modifying the proposed wall construction to provide adequate access. It is important to note that the interpretation and application of the NEC can be complex and may vary depending on local jurisdictions. Therefore, it is always recommended to consult with a qualified electrical engineer or inspector to ensure compliance with all applicable codes and standards. These professionals possess the expertise to assess the specific installation and provide tailored recommendations for ensuring safety and code adherence. In conclusion, the proposed scenario does not meet the criteria for utilizing exceptions within NEC 110.26c. The limited space behind the substation and the obstruction caused by the new wall preclude the application of these exceptions. The standard clear space requirements of NEC 110.26 and B must be adhered to, and appropriate measures must be taken to ensure compliance.